Well, we're going to get started today. This week we're looking at Africa. You notice we've been moving around the globe. Asia, Central Asia, Middle East, Europe to some extent, the Americas. We have yet to say a lot. Well, we have talked about Africa in different contexts. But today we want to take a look at early Africa, what you might call, some might call ancient Africa, if you will. As we do that, I suppose, as I often do, we should look at some of the geography of Africa, because I notice that a lot of times people don't have maybe a good sense about geography. So I always try to include it. In fact, I used to put a map on every test, but I don't do that anymore. Thank you. That means people don't learn the geography at all. I used to put a map, with the study terms. You see, the study terms and stuff is hard now. It used to be 20 terms per chapter, and for every 5 chapters, therefore 100 terms, there will also be 3 maps that you'd have to label, shade, things like that. But I don't do that anymore. So I don't, Anyway, but I do still, even though I don't do that, I do still think geography is very important for a variety of things. Certainly it's important for the study of history. It's the playing field of where history takes place. And people are limited and in many ways influenced by the geography in which they find themselves. Okay? Here in Florida, very flat. Very flat. A lot of water, a lot of swamps, a lot of alligators ready to chomp you up. When I lived in Kentucky, lots of hills, small mountains, some people might call it. Lots of vegetation, lots of trees. Well, here in Africa, we can divide it into different sections. And so a lot of times when people talk about Africa, they'll say, well, this is in Africa. And then some people say, well, that's not really what I'm talking about when I talk about Africa. Africa is a huge continent and quite diverse, but we tend to label it all together. That is, we, I guess, as people in America, tend to label, we just say that is African or that is Africa, and there's very diverse. For example, all the kind of large herds of animals, what's left of them and so forth, that's mostly in Central and Northern South Africa, and a huge desert across here, the Sahara, mountains up in the north. You have North Africa. A lot of people don't even consider North Africa part of Africa, but it is. Egypt, part of Africa, so we've already talked about Egypt. And then, of course, South Africa, it's its own world. Okay, so let's take a look at some of these, some of the geography of Africa. It's the largest of the continents. Just to give you an idea, it's maybe hard for you to imagine, but it's 5,000 miles from the north coast to the south coast. 5,000 miles long, okay? That's a long, long ways. North Africa is all of this area up here. And of course, today this would include Egypt, Libya, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, This is all North Africa. North Africa then looks to the Mediterranean, to its north, is connected quite a bit to then other parts of the Mediterranean world and the Middle East. So a lot of people group North Africa in with the Middle East because many of the people who live there today are Muslim and have had connections to the Middle East. Then, of course, the Great Sahara Desert. And in fact, this then gives rise to another designation in Africa, and that is Sub-Saharan Africa. People always will often designate Sub-Saharan Africa and divide it from Sahara and North Africa. I suppose that's fair. But the Sahara then is a very large desert that you may not think of a huge desert being in Africa. A lot of people think of, jungle, rainforest, that sort of thing. But there's a lot of diversity in this huge, huge continent. All right? So this just gives you some of the ways you can divide it. West Africa, Northeast Africa, Central Africa, Southern Africa. And those are really big chunks. This map gives you an idea of elevations in Africa. The lighter the color, I guess, the tanner, the color, the higher the elevation. So you can see up here in the north, fairly high elevation. That's the Atlas Mountains, as they're called. The Atlas Mountains up here. And then, of course, if you look down this side of Africa, on the east side, there is a great rift valley, as it's called. There is a great rift that starts up here in Turkey, goes all the way down through Palestine, actually forms the Red Sea, and comes all the way down through Africa, all the way down to South Africa. It has its own kind of wildlife, ecosystems, and that sort of thing. But that's called the Great Rift Valley. And it's actually a tear in the crust of the earth with one plate moving northward and another plate moving southward. And the tear in between creates the mountains, deep valley. For example, you've heard of the Dead Sea. In the Dead Sea Valley, and the earthquakes that happen, that's going all the way down through Africa as well. So sub-Saharan then Africa is a category of Africa we can talk about. West Africa, more tropical, more water, more rain, a lot of rich resources over this way. Including not only all the vegetation and wildlife, but gold. Gold coming out of the Niger River. They pan the gold, they pan it, and can obtain gold there. East Africa, over here, drier. But this is the place that you see, really, I think probably most movies, most Disney stuff. Everybody loves the Disney stuff, right? A lot of the Disney stuff is really in East Africa, like the Lion King and all that sort of stuff. When you think of the savannah, and you see the big plains with a few trees on it and all kinds of big herds of animals, right? Gazelles and zebras and all that kind of stuff. That's over in this part of Africa, all right? Drier, not as much vegetation as you have over here. Safari country. Safari just really means a trip, a journey. But of course it's come to mean a particular kind of trip in most people's minds today, where you're hunting animals. Equatorial, this is another way in which you can divide section. The equator going through right about here. So that means that everything north of that is on the same seasons that we sort of follow. Everything south of that is reversed in its seasons. Right? So we're getting ready to enter winter in the north. Of course, winter in Florida is, to me, not really winter. But, I noticed today coming in that, I know the high is only supposed to be like 87 today. I saw people wearing flannel shirts, very warm hats, sweatshirts, overcoats. It's only going to get up to like 86 or 87. I mean, how could we survive this frigid weather? Well, they tell me I'm going to get used to it. I don't know. Maybe too late for me, but maybe some. Equatorial. That means the section of land along the equator. And then, of course, South Africa, whole different setup down there as far as resources and things. Lots of gold down that way, but also lots of diamonds, diamond mines, rich mineral wealth from down in this part of Africa. And all of that, all of the resources and the geography, the terrain has affected the history. Okay, so that's kind of just an introduction. Now, the thing about the history of Africa, part of the problem is we don't have written sources like we don't have in many of these, like say in North and South America, no written sources there really, not much until you get into the Columbian period, that is the period when the Europeans show up. Well, here is that Rift Valley that I told you about. See, it starts clear up here with Turkey, comes down through Syria and Lebanon, forming the Lebanon and anti-Lebanon mountains, coming down through and forming the valley which forms the Sea of Galilee, the Dead Sea, on down to the Red Sea, and then you see it comes right across here, and it goes right on down through Africa, all the way down to the southern part. There are also major rivers that you'll need to know about if you want to understand Africa. One of them, of course, we've already talked about quite a bit, is the Nile. The Nile is the longest river in the world. Here you can see it with its tributaries and flowing up towards the Mediterranean. The blue and the white Nile forming together, coming out of the mountains of Ethiopia and flowing northward through the Sahara Desert. The Niger is over on the other side of Africa, a very important river. The Congo, the Zambezi. These are major rivers of the continent of Africa. There's also, besides the Sahara Desert, there's the Kalahari Desert, which is in South Africa. Many people would suggest it's maybe not a true desert. Maybe not dry enough to be a true desert, but desert-like. There is the Horn of Africa, which you see here. Some people call this the Horn of Africa, which jets out into the Indian Ocean around the areas of Ethiopia and Somalia. And of course, the very large island, which is often associated with Africa, known as Madagascar, which you see here. Very interesting place with diverse animals and plants and that sort of thing. You got a question? Oh, okay, I thought you had a question. Never mind. Of course, we have on this side the Indian Ocean, and on the other side we have the Atlantic Ocean. To the north there is the Mediterranean Sea. At the very south we have the Cape of Good Hope. Cape of Good Hope got its name because as especially the Europeans were trying to sail around Africa, they finally got to the point where they had some hope that they would survive and they would actually be able to sail around this continent, which is huge. Okay? So that's way at the bottom down here in the south, the Cape of Good Hope. So these are just different geographic features. And we've already mentioned the Great Rift Valley. All right, so I'm going to now show you the whole continent in this physiographic setting so you can really get an idea of the terrain of it, I hope. You can see the Great Rift Valley very clearly here. You can see the uplands areas of South Africa. You can see the mountainous areas over here around Ethiopia and the Atlas. You can see that the desert is not just flat, also it has some mountainous areas in it. You can also see the Niger River over here, of course the Nile, Madagascar. So I put this up because it's I think it really does show a physiographic principles that are hard to see in some maps. Well, we want to focus in today on ancient Africa, where we have some of the oldest civilizations in Africa. Now, we have already talked about Egypt in here. That was covered earlier. I don't have time to go back and include that discussion, but I refer you back to like week 1, I guess, when we talked about Egypt. But there are other civilizations near the Nile or further up the Nile, which in this case would be down on the map because you remember the Nile flows to the north. So here is part of Egypt to the north. You see Thebes, you should recognize that. Valley of the Kings, and then the Nile. Aswan, also part of Egypt. Coming to the first cataracts, you remember we talked about there are a series of cataracts or rapids on the river. Here is the 6th one. Here's the 4th one, the 5th one, and so forth. So you see, so 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th. Down here. So we see also the White Nile and the Blue Nile, which come together down here by Khartoum. That's where they flow together. And this forms the Nile River then. Notice how it winds around. Most of this time it's flowing right through the middle of an extensive desert. So this is really unique, and this is what makes life possible along this river because of the water that it provides even in a very dry area. So we want to take a look especially now south of Egypt. Egypt will come into this area and it will conquer it and certainly have interaction with it. Notice down here when we have Meroe. We're going to talk about Meroe, for example. Well, the earliest civilizations in Egypt are in Africa is Egypt. But as Egypt's power grows, it will move southward along the Nile. Can I get you to put the phone away, please? Maybe turn around so you can not fall asleep. Thanks. We also have in this area Nubia. You might have heard of Nubia and Nubians. They're from this part of Africa as well. Now the Egyptians will move into this area. They will come to dominate it for many years, but then later on Egypt is weaker, and in fact Nubia becomes stronger, and Nubia will extend its control a bit further north. So these things are fluid. But one thing that is constant, there is a lot of trade between these two parts of Egypt and Nubia, these two parts of the Nile River Valley. Take the earphone out. Thanks. Egypt controls this area of Nubia for almost 500 years, 400 plus years, let's say. And of course, there's a lot of Egyptian influence then. When you come down to Nubia, you take a look at the stuff there. I think I've got a picture here in a minute. You're going to see a lot of things that look familiar to you, like pyramids. I mean, they look familiar, but they also look different. And the way in which the statuary is of the rulers and things like that. A lot of influence. But the things that the Egyptians are interested in with this part of the Nile River area is the things that can come from this area that they simply don't have there. For example, things like ebony. Ebony. Anybody know what ebony is? We use the word, but it's... What's that? It's not an ore. Yeah?
Is it like timber?
Yeah, a tree. You said a tree, timber, wood. Ebony is it comes from a tree, and the tree has a very dark look to it. Okay? Almost black or very dark brown. And so the tree was actually harvested, and in fact they've taken probably too many of them because of that particular color of it that people found useful and decorative and so forth. For example, if you take a look on a piano, we have black keys on a piano. Not anymore, but it used to be every piano, the black keys were ebony keys. And the white keys were made from what? Ivory. That's another thing that they're getting. And ivory comes from where?
Tusks of walrus, not elephants.
Tusks primarily of elephants. Right? So it's white. It has a very white, it's shiny, smooth. So very good for piano keys, right? Because they're smooth and white. And then you put the ebony with it, and you have the contrast of the two keys. It makes it easier, I guess, if you're playing to know where you're playing, right? What you're hitting, and that's part of why it was there. So the piano keyboard was actually for many years basically mostly coming from Africa. So goods from Africa making up the keyboard. Okay. I remember in one class, the reason I stop and make sure you know what that is I had, in one class many years ago, I asked about ivory and said, what is it? I was just talking about ivory. And I said, okay, this is what it is, and so forth. And then I had a young lady raise her hand and said, is that what they make the soap out of? African, like elephant tusks. And that's why they call it ivory. So I said, no. I said, I think they just call it that because the soap kind of looks like it's ivory, not that it's made out of ivory. Because ivory soap is very sort of white and shiny and light. I don't know if people buy it anymore, but it used to be very popular. Soap, borrow soap, that sort of thing. All right, and also frankincense. Do anybody know where you obtain frankincense? You're going to hear about it pretty soon because, pretty soon the semester will be over. It'll be Christmas time, and you'll be hearing all kinds of stuff about frankincense and gold and myrrh. Yes?
Is it called boswellia?
Boswellia? Well, I don't know. Maybe it has that name. I usually just hear it called. Well, where do you think it's coming from? Where does boswellia come from?
It's like a root.
A root. Okay, yeah, you're on the right track. Frankincense does come from a plant. It comes from a small shrub, I guess we might call it. Not quite a tree. It's not that big. And what they actually do is they cut the bark, they cut the trunk or whatever of the shrub, and it oozes out sap. Okay? So when the sap oozes out, they cut that off, and that's basically frankincense. It has that smell. That's a natural odor, a natural fragrance, I guess. I guess if something, people like it, they call it a fragrance. If they don't like it, they call it an odor. Is that what it is? That's a weird odor. That means you don't like it. If that's, ooh, that's a nice fragrance. Anyway, but it is. You just let the sap sort of dry. It'll dry in little globules, and then that's what is frankincense. And then you can light it, and it smokes. It'll put off kind of a whitish smoke, and that smoke is very odorous, very fragrant, and it's used in a variety of things. It could be used burnt as an incense, often used in religious practices to represent prayers rising up to heaven. Can also be infused into oils, which is really how ancient perfumes were made. They took fragrant things and infused it into oil, and then you put the oil on you, and you smell like flowers and that kind of thing. Okay. And leopard skins, other kind of animals that are down here that you're not going to find up in this part of the Nile. Well, Kush. Let's talk about Kush. You can spell it with a K. You can spell it with a C. Ancient Kush. At the end of the New Kingdom, about 1085, Nubia gets its independence from Egypt, and when it does, then it's often called Kush. By the way, check out the Bible. See, I'm always telling you to do that. That's that book that I recommend to you. There's a guy in there called Moses. Moses has a wife later in life, and she is a Cushite woman. Well, check it out. See if I'm right. A Cushite woman. A woman from Nubia. Well, independent, it's Kush. Kush then will come down and grow as a kingdom. And you can see here are some Nubian or Kushite statues. They look a lot like Egyptian stuff, right? These guys look a lot like pharaohs of Egypt. They look a little different. They do have writing, hieroglyphs, much of which they borrowed from Egypt. But they get more powerful as Egypt gets weak, and they in fact come down and control Lower Egypt, as you can see there, for a little less than 100 years. But once you get past about 1,000, let's say about 1,000 BC, Egypt is much less powerful and is often controlled by outside forces, including the Assyrians and the Persians and the Nubians. Here is this book cover. You see some of the pyramids of Kush. They are much steeper in their incline than the ones, and smaller than the ones you have, more famous ones to the north. Well, how did the Kushite control end? It got ended when the Assyrians took control of Egypt and pushed the Kushites back to the south. So the real power of Egypt, when it's really powerful, would be in the New Kingdom. That's when it's an empire. After the New Kingdom, it begins to decline in its influence. Well, the civilization of Cush borrows much from Egypt, borrows, sort of architectural forms, writing. The idea of burying their kings in pyramids, they did that in Cush or Nubia as well. Although, as I've said, the pyramids are much smaller and much steeper. So you get up higher without as much. It's kind of hard to see in that picture, but you get higher without as much stone because you're going at a much steeper angle. But of course, it's not just a copy of Egypt. It's also has some of its own characteristics, its own history and culture, no doubt about it. One is an untranslated phonetic script. The hieroglyphs that they use are Egyptian in background, but they have another script, another form of writing, which is yet to be translated because we don't have a lot of examples. And their government is more decentralized. The Egyptian government was heavily centralized with the pharaoh, and Nubia is a more decentralized form of government. What about Merowe? Here you can see it made it into some game about Indiana Jones from long ago. Probably doesn't exist anymore. But Merowe, and you can see its position. Up here is Giza, right about there is Luxor, and down here is Aswan, and way down here is Merowe. And here are some of the pyramids in this area. Notice how they're very pointy, not as wide. They get a lot of height there, but they are a much steeper angle of construction. Merowe has trade that we might expect from this part of the world. They're able to obtain gold and ivory from further south in Africa, but also iron. There's iron ore in some of the mountains. And as we'll see, iron production will take place in Africa. Merowe will mix Egyptian ideas with Greco-Roman imagery and ideas, and makes a real blended, a very blended culture. It declines when invaded by Aksamites in 350. So next I'm going to show you a map that will show you where these areas are located. Here you can see the Nile. Here is Cush. Down here is Merowe. You see that? And a sort of shaded area is the area of Cush. Aksum, as you can see, is located a little closer to the coast. And Merowe is here. Aksum is over here, which has considerable territory along the Red Sea. Okay? So Aksum kingdom pretty much takes over the area of Kush. Well, one interesting thing about Aksum is, in fact, they convert to Christianity. They sack Meroe in 350. The king, Ezana, converts to Christianity, and so we actually have a Christian kingdom here in this part of Africa. You can see located on the map how far south it is, right across from the point of Arabia here. And here's the Nile depicted for us. Aksum rises in power and has a lot of connections right across the Red Sea over here in Arabia as well, with an area known as Saba. And in fact, Aksum was a colony of Saba. Saba is the name of it, most people believe, is related to Sheba. You probably heard of the Queen of Sheba. Her territory was down in this part of Arabia, most normally associated with Yemen. And if you remember Sheba, what is she famous for doing? Probably most famous for doing, anyway. It's in that book called the Bible I keep referring to. Sheba is mentioned.
She went to see King Solomon?
Yes, she went to see King Solomon, and she was impressed, I guess we'd say, by his wealth. And she stays for a while and then returns. Well, according to other stories, her and Solomon were friendly. So friendly, in fact, that a child was born. I don't know how that works because this is not a biology class, but anyway, this is part of the idea that some people say. Of course, that's not in the Bible, but it says that Sheba gave birth to Solomon's child. And of course, then the connection here is made. Saba then is a major trading center in this part of Arabia with connections over here in Africa. So you can read about that in 1 Kings chapter 10. That's in the Bible, by the way. The Queen of Sheba and King Solomon. Well, you know, I suppose not hard to believe. I mean, Solomon is famous for having 1,000 women. We don't emphasize that part, I guess, but he had 300 wives and 700 concubines, according to the Bible. So I don't suppose it's hard to believe that he and Sheba were more than friends, although it's not recorded in the Bible. I guess that's 700 wives and 300 concubines. I had it backwards. Well, anyway, you can look it up and find out for yourself. I mean, you have this whole break coming up with nothing to do. You're just going to be laying around, eating Doritos, letting your mother do your laundry while you watch Netflix and stuff. I mean, you know, you could try to do something else. At least go outside once. I'm sure your car's already loaded. You packed all of your dirty laundry into the trunk, maybe the back seat. When you arrive, you'll tell your mother, "Here are the keys to my car." I would like all my laundry washed, please, folded and put back into my car. To which your mother will be very pleased that you're home. And you'll say, what do we got to eat? You ever say that to your mother? What are we going to eat? Where's all the food? I'm just saying, be nice to your mother. That's all. I mean, I know I'm radical that way. I'm just saying, your mother will be happy to see you. I'm pretty sure for most of you, maybe a few of you know, but most of you, yes. But it doesn't mean she wants to do all your laundry and cook for you for the next 4 days. Although she's happy to help. Maybe you could do something nice for your mother sometime. Just a suggestion. Maybe communicate with her when you don't need anything. So she doesn't get the idea that's the only time she hears from you. This is just friendly family advice. All right, let's move on. Here he is, Shlomo, Solomon, that's his name in Hebrew, Shlomo, and his bride, Sheba, getting married. And, by the way, you see this? Little Shlomo, little Solomon. I like his hat. Got nice hats in this picture. But there he is. We'll talk a little more about that in a moment. Well, what does Oxum export? Again, ivory, yes, myrrh, we have frankincense, probably even a little gold, just in case you're getting ready for Christmas. Myrrh, by the way, is another incense. And those things are expensive. I think that's why it's mentioned that when the wise guys come to see Jesus, they bring with them gold, frankincense, and myrrh, right? How many wise men were there? Three? Zero. He's saying there's no wise men. Three? We usually say three, and we even have names for them. Again, not in the Bible. But we actually don't know. We know there was more than one because they're wise men, not a wise man. The assumption is there are three because there are three gifts. Casper, Melchior, and so forth. Balthazar. I think those are the three names given later on. But also slaves. Take a look at that. Slavery entering into the picture here. Now, Oxum, the king of Oxum, claims to be descended from Solomon and Sheba. In other words, they're saying we are a royal family, but our family goes back to and is connected to Solomon. And in Oxum, anyway, they're going to follow Judaism rather than Christianity. In other words, they're going to be a particular kind of Jewish faith. Now, eventually, they will convert to Christianity later. They're going to convert to a Orthodox form of Christianity, the same kind of Christianity that they have in Egypt, which is called Coptic Christianity. Anybody here ever heard of Coptic Christians? I assume we don't have any Coptic Christians in our midst. Coptic Christianity is orthodox in nature, but they actually use Coptic language in their services still today. They claim, the Coptic Christians of Egypt claim that they are the ones that are true Egyptian because they are not related to Arabs. And that the Arabs came into Egypt and took it over. But that the Coptic Christians date their ancestry back much further. So at about AD 350, we have Coptic Christianity in this part of Africa. Okay. Now, Aksum today can be related to the country of Ethiopia. You've heard of Ethiopia? What's that?
My best friend's an Ethiopian Orthodox.
There you go. Okay. I would assume still today the Ethiopian Orthodox have some connections anyway, historically, with Coptic Orthodoxy. In fact, if you go to Jerusalem, like many of you will next summer when I go to excavate, you're going to come with me. We will go to Jerusalem, the holy city, and we'll go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It's an interesting place because basically there Christians fight over the church. I mean, the physical space in the church. And they actually have it divided up very rigidly into sections, that this is Franciscan, and this is Dominican, and this is Greek Orthodox, and so forth. But coming lately to, what made me think of it, is coming lately to the church were the Ethiopic Christians, right? The Ethiopian Orthodox Church. You know what part of the church they got? Part of the roof. I'm serious. They're way up high. You can actually enter the church that way. I've entered it a couple times that way. It's a different way to come into the church. You come in and you can actually walk through their little chapel, and then you have to go downstairs and you go into the rest of the church. I'll figure out if I can find it again. But anyway, when you come next summer to dig, we're gonna dig up the hometown of Samson. You heard of Samson? Strong guy. Had a friend named Delilah. You don't find too many ladies named Delilah these days. I suppose because of the connotation of what Delilah was or did. Of course, I guess you don't find too many guys named Samson either. So, anyway, fair enough. Okay. Well, for some reason I thought of that. I guess when Ethiopia, because, you know, everybody fights over the space. In fact, everybody fights over the space so much until it comes time to pay for bills. Then it's like, well, that's not our problem. For example, several years ago now, the roof of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was starting to need a lot of repair. It was going to fall apart and leak and all that kind of stuff. And nobody wanted to pay for it. You would think all these different groups would come together and, you know, chip in and let's get the roof fixed. But they can't get along. Matter of fact, they can't get along so much. You know, the guy who has the key to the door of the church is a Muslim. Because they don't trust each other. I have a Muslim guy who unlocks that family. They unlock the door every day and they lock it up at night. And the only way they got the roof fixed is the mayor of Jerusalem, who of course is Jewish, basically said, I'm going to condemn this building and shut it down as a safety concerns if you don't get the roof fixed. And only after that prompting did they finally come together and figure out a way to pay for the roof repairs. Because the only people actually using any of the roof are the Ethiopian Christians. That's because by the time they got there to claim part of it, everything else was claimed, and so they've taken a little corner of part of the roof. Well, let's talk now a little bit about the Sahara. Here you see a picture in the upper right of the screen. This is your, this is a way to look at the Sahara, right? This is the image we have in our mind of a desert. Big mounds, the sand dunes, camels. Well, the Sahara is a barrier, and take a look where it is on the other map, lower right. You can see the Sahara there. Covers the entire northern part of the continent. So really the desert is very difficult to cross. It'd be quite challenging, but it's not uncrossable. If you are, determined and you have some practice, you can actually cross it. So there was some trans-Saharan trade. It would bring goods from the Mediterranean south and goods from the south up to the Mediterranean. Beginning as early as about 1000 BC. Now, by the way, using the camel is a misnomer, at least most people believe, that there might have been camels there long before, but they were extinct and were reintroduced in 100 BC. So that means that for most of the history, even the ancient history we're talking about, the camel was not around to be used in the Sahara Desert. But you got the good old donkeys. Donkeys are pretty tough. And actually, donkeys went across the desert. They did a fair job to carry the goods. Much of the goods that were coming across were luxury items, particular items. Pretty common. Trans-Saharan trade was common in the Roman times. Not so much before that. And of course, by the time you're getting into the Roman times, then you do have the introduction of the camel around 100 BC. So you can start to use camels. That's going to make it easier. The trade is coming across to Carthage, which is right about there. And then, of course, after the Romans conquered Carthage, that we talked about in here earlier, then the goods will be coming to North Africa, which is controlled by the Romans. What are some of the things that they're transporting? Gold, copper, salt. Do you know that salt, today, they say most people maybe eat too much salt. Salt is abundant. Salt is cheap. You can go to the store and buy an entire container of salt for probably 50 cents. You can buy an awful lot of salt for $1, all right? You can even buy your hipster salt, right? You know what the hipster salt is. The salt that you have to actually grind it up yourself, and it says it came from the Himalayas. I'm thinking, how did they get salt up in the Himalayas? I guess they had to haul it up there and let it sit up there for a while so they can tell you it's from the Himalayas. Anyway, I usually don't buy what I call the hipster salt, the fancy salt. I just buy good old ionized salt in a little blue round container. You can get that pretty cheap. But in ancient times, salt was a necessary. I mean, you got to have salt to survive. If you don't have salt, you don't eat any salt, don't have any salt, you will die. So you have to have salt, and it was hard to obtain. Mostly it was mined out of, like you mine coal and stuff, you had to go underground. You'd find salt crystals in the rock. You'd chip it out, haul it to the surface, then you could pulverize it or whatever, put it in your food. So salt, gold, copper, skins of various animal skins. Who knows? Maybe lions and tigers and bears. Oh my. No, maybe not those. Gemstones. You know, they have an interesting gemstone that is called in some of the sources as a carbuncle. If you look up carbuncle, it has an interesting history. It means something that's red, but it's often referring to something that somebody gets on their skin. A carbuncle, like a boil or something. But carbuncle, as it's being used here, I think means a red stone. Rubies, maybe, garnets. Anyway, a precious or semi-precious red stone. And also slaves would be taken on this route as well. It's by these caravans that may have brought the technology for making iron to the west part of Africa. It appears that originally learning how to work iron was over here in East Africa, but we do then find the technology to practice in West Africa, and many people think that these caravan routes not only went across the Sahara north-south, but they also connected east-west. The culture which works iron, usually people believe they developed iron working in Africa, are called the Nok. N-O-K, the Nok culture. Around 500 BC is when iron working, smelting, that sort of thing, came into practice in Africa. So you think about that and you think, okay, all right, got iron. But of course, you can make tools, you can make weapons. They're much stronger that way. And but there's a lot to it. If I gave you, even if I handed you iron ore and said, okay, make me some iron, that would be a difficult process for you. My guess is most people in here would not be able to do that. I guess you can Google it now, right, and try to figure it out. But I mean, there's a lot of things to overcome, things to figure out. How do I make this? First of all, how you recognize an iron ore, what it is, and how do you get it? But even if you already have it, how do I take that and make it, say, into a knife or some tool or weapon? Well, here are some of these trade routes as they have been identified. Notice them across the Sahara here, north to south. Some even coming from the Nile Valley further south. Here, by the way, is a good depiction of the Niger River. And of course, probably one of your favorite towns, Timbuktu, up here at the top, on the edge of the desert and not far from the river. So this is the area that is quite wet, tropical. Then over here it's drier, the savanna. All right. So here are some of the trade routes. Well, East Africa, one of the things we can talk about with East Africa is Herodotus makes an interesting thing. We've mentioned Herodotus before. You remember him. He's a Greek historian of the 5th century. Does anybody remember when we've mentioned Herodotus previously in our class? Mentioning, this is at least third time I can remember, maybe the fourth. Anybody remember? We just mentioned him last week. It wasn't that long ago. No? The uncomfortable pauses. Some people call it a pregnant pause, but I suppose that's only if it gives birth to some discussion. So maybe our pauses are not that pregnant. Well, I mentioned him last week in discussion of the Arabs. You remember that? And we said that Herodotus had mentioned Arabs in the 5th century BC. That's when we were beginning our discussion of Arabs. We also mentioned him in connection with Egypt, that he said Egypt was the gift of the Nile. Well, anyway, Herodotus, interesting source, he mentions a lot of things that he hears. Some are things that he sees, some are things that he's read or heard. Tries to compile things together. But he mentions that the Phoenicians sailed south on the Red Sea. Let me go back to this map. Well, we can't really see it on that map. I don't want to go that far back. But over here on the Red Sea, and they're going to sail down this side of Africa. All right? And in their accounts, it's said that they sailed all the way to the Straits of Gibraltar. Anybody know where that is? There's the Straits of Gibraltar. So what they're saying is that the Phoenicians sailed this way, all the way down, all the way around, and up to the Straits of Gibraltar. That's a long ways. In other words, Herodotus is conveying an idea that the Phoenicians circumnavigated Africa hundreds of years before the Europeans. Right? Almost 2,000 years before the Europeans, so a long time before. And Herodotus expresses a little skepticism because he said during the accounts, they said they went to a part of the world where the sun rose on the opposite side of the world. Yeah, think about that. But if you're sailing down this side of Africa, which side is the sun rising? You're sailing south this way. What? But you're sailing south, would it be on your left or your right? The sun would rise.
Right,
Your left. And it would set on your right. So in other words, it would rise over water and it would set over land. I mean, if you're close enough to see the land. But guess what? If you come all the way down around here, the water rises over the sun rises over the land and sets over the water. So basically the way one of the accounts read is that they had sailed so far that they came to a place where the sun rose and set on the opposite side of the world. Well, what seems like a pretty strange comment actually becomes somewhat of a confirmation that if you were sailing this way, you would see the sun rising for many, many days on your left and up over the water. Once you turn the corner of the Cape of Good Hope and come up this way, now the sun's going to rise over the land and set over the water. So just the opposite. Well, did the Phoenicians actually do that? Some people think yes. No, I think it's possible. Phoenicians were great sailors. In fact, there was a guy who, I don't know how many years ago now, probably about 6 years ago, who decided to test it. He put a boat in the Red Sea, and he sailed all the way around Africa. And he sailed all the way back to Israel, all the way back to Haifa. I think it was Haifa. And completed that. Well, some also believe that Africa, their geography, their knowledge of Africa was not good. They believed that Africa was bent around, you know how Europe and Africa formed the shores of the Mediterranean. They felt that Africa bent around the Indian Ocean and came close to India, and then that the Indian Ocean was much like the Mediterranean and was enclosed. I put this up here to remind you that Phoenicians invented the alphabet that we use today. Even the parrot knows. All right. By AD 100, certainly the Red Sea in East Africa is a commercial area. There is a book written in Greek called the Periplus, which describes the trade between East Africa and especially India and places further in that direction. We do have a record then of what things that they picked up in Africa along the East Coast that they would take and trade for other goods. Ivory, see, ivory showing up again. Ivory's been a desired commodity for thousands of years. Rhino horn. You know, the rhino horn is still greatly desired in Asia. Anybody know why?
Some kind of medicine, isn't it?
Sort of a medicine. I think I would call it Viagra of Asia. Many people believe if you take the rhino horn and I guess they powder it into a powder and mix it into something and eat it or whatever, that it will be an aphrodisiac and be much like the Western Viagra stuff. Unfortunately for the rhino, a lot of people believe that, so there aren't too many rhinos left because this is what happens to most of them. They shoot them, cut the horn off, sell it for thousands of dollars. Tortoise shells, again, nice for decoration. And what do they want? What do they trade for? Glass. They did not have glass, and they really liked glass. Grain, different kinds of grain, and wine. So this was the trade. And by the way, that guy built a Phoenician, he copied a Phoenician sort of ship and built it. And he ended up, I traced him, he did actually make it all the way around. Did not succumb to the weather or to pirates. Because I was worried about more of the pirates with him than anything else, because there are a lot of people that might attack him out there. Well, contact with Asia certainly comes in East Africa. I put this diagram up here that shows the prevalent winds. And there are different cycles of the winds, sometimes called the monsoon rains. If you sail out this way, okay, you can actually then return into two different monsoon seasons. You have prevalent winds. One will carry you eastward, and the other you can tack back. You see, if you know anything about sailing, I see we got some sailors in our midst. Well, you can use the south wind to tack yourself back to the west. The monsoon winds make contact with India easier during that period. The trade then will bring Malay merchants to Africa from Asia. And so, in fact, they begin to grow cinnamon in Africa, but it's not native to Africa. It was brought there from Malaysia, Malay. Do you know how you get cinnamon?
Is it a root?
It's not really a root. It's a bark. Yeah, it's sort of like the outer. If you see sticks of cinnamon, that have not been all pulverized up. You can see they actually look like sticks, actually, hollowed out. It's the bark that brings that distinctive flavor. They might also have brought bananas and yams, which are foods native to Asia, to Africa. And of course, once in Africa, spreads elsewhere. Okay? Eventually, bananas then brought to South of Central America, too. Oh, by the way, there's the cinnamon sticks. See them? Yeah. Well, we see then that in South Africa, there are various dialects of Bantu. People speaking the dialects of Bantu will move to the east and settle in the south. These people are primarily farmers, but they have iron technology and they're using iron tools. They live here from about 400 to 500 BC, organizing themselves into tribes, with the males really being the warriors and the women being the farmers. And for our last screen, this is just a map, a diagram, to show you all the various Bantu dialects across South Africa. All right, we'll leave it there for today. I hope you have a good break.